In regards to the witnesses that we accept for testifying about the new moon and sanctifying the new month, there's a machloikes between Reb Shimon and the Rabbanon. Reb Shimon is of the opinion that a father and son, and so to all relatives, are kosher to come together as witnesses to testify about the new moon for the new month. Although usually witnesses wouldn't be accepted together if they are relatives to each other. Because in the Pasuk it says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe v'el Aaron, HaChodesh hazel lochem, this month will be for you, etc., which is generally the Pasuk where we learn out the whole concept of Kiddush HaChodesh from. So Reb Shimon learns that Hashem is saying that this Eidus will be kosher by someone like you, like Moshe and Aaron, who are brothers, which implies that two brothers would be kosher and relatives would be kosher to testify together. On the other hand, the Rabbanon hold that relatives would be puzzled. They wouldn't be allowed to testify together about the new moon. And when the Pasuk says, HaChodesh hazel lochem, what the Pasuk is trying to say is that this Eidus, the testifying for the new month, is given over to people like you, like Moshe and Aaron, meaning that it's only a Beis Din that could accept the testimony and then sanctify the new month. But it has nothing to do with anything to do with the witnesses themselves or relatives, etc. The Rebbe Maharash explains the reason of Rab Shimon, why Eidus HaChodesh would be different to all other testimonies where we would accept, according to Rab Shimon, relatives. He says it's because that really, even without the witnesses, based on their calculations, when Rosh Chodesh would be. Similar to nowadays, where we don't have the Beis Din at all, sanctifying the new month based on the citing of the witnesses. So now we only rely on the calculations. And therefore, the witnesses aren't like something that without them we wouldn't have known at all what had happened, or that there's the new moon, and therefore in this type of situation, even relatives would be kosher for this sort of Eidus. So the Rebbe asks, we need to understand the reason why relatives are usually disqualified from being witnesses together. So the Gemara says it's not actually because of the concern of maybe they're going to be lying, but rather it's Gzeiras Melechu, it's purely a decree of Hashem. If that's the case, what difference does it make that Beis Din would know anyways, according to the calculation, about the truth of what they're testifying? Says the Rebbe, we could explain it as follows. Generally, Eidus is not only coming to clarify or to verify, according to logic, what took place and telling us what actually happened. But rather, when Eidus comes, it becomes a din. It becomes like sort of confirmed that this is what we are, that this is the established fact. It's a Gzeiras HaKosov. The Torah says, Al Pi Shnei Eidim Yakum Dover. Once two witnesses come, it's established in this particular way. In fact, the Rambam explains that we were commanded to judge a case based on two kosher witnesses, even though it's technically possible that they're lying. Yet the Torah is telling us once two witnesses come, it's now established that this is the way the situation is. Says the Rebbe, but the same thing is true also in the other extreme. That is that the fact that relatives are posel le'edus, it's also a Gzeiras HaKosov, meaning to say, even in a situation where there's no concern that they're going to be lying, nevertheless, we're not going to accept them if they're relatives. Why? Because the power of Eidus is not only because of the logical idea that we are clarifying or verifying a particular situation based on these two people, but rather it got a strength according to Torah. And therefore, when it comes to relatives, the Torah didn't give relatives this sort of power. So it has nothing to do with whether we're concerned about if they're lying or not. Now that's in irregular cases of testimony where we need the Eidus to have this power that Torah is entrusting them with to give a certain case a specific amount of power. However, says the Rebbe, since in the case of Kiddush HaChodesh, we actually don't need this special strength that Eidus have to establish something. Because really, as we said, we really have the idea of calculations anyways. And as we said before, that's why Nowadays, when we don't have the citing of the edus at all, we're just relying on the calculations. Therefore, in this type of edus, where we don't really need the edus aspect per se so much, according to Rab Shimon, that says, in our case, what's the whole point? It's only bitter. It's only the clarification that we need from the edus, but it doesn't really need that strength of edus because we know the calculations. So therefore, in a case where there's no concern that they might lie, like in our case with Kiddush HaChodesh, usually you wouldn't say that edus are biased in any way for why they should say that they saw the moon if they didn't. So therefore, they're going to be kosher to edus. Again, just to summarize and to clarify this last point. In a regular case of edus, where we need the edus to actually to establish a certain idea, the Torah gave the edus the power that they are establishing that this is what happened. So then, of course, relatives also won't work because Torah gave this power not to relatives, only to people that are not relatives to each other. But again, in our case, where we don't really need the edus so much to really confirm what happened, because again, the Beis Din knows anyways based on their calculations, so it's not so much the regular din of edus, and therefore, according to Rab Shimon, the relatives would be kosher to edus. Says the Rebbe, based on this explanation, we could also explain another question that could be asked on Rab Shimon's opinion. The halacha is that generally Gerim converts are not considered relatives as far as testimony is concerned. That means even two brothers that were born biological brothers, later they both converted, they could testify for each other, and the reason is because once a Ger converts, he's considered like a newborn child, doesn't have any relatives. So here's the problem. If we go according to the view that by Yetzias Mitzrayim, Yidden all had the halachic status of Gerim, so then the question is as follows. What would be the proof? What's Rab Shimon's proof from Moshe and Aaron that Moshe and Aaron could testify? If Moshe and Aaron have a din of Gerim, meaning they're not related to each other halachically, then how can we learn from that din for after Matan Torah that relatives would be allowed to testify for each other? But based on what we explained, that there's something very unique about Eidus HaChodesh, that we don't really need the proper Eidus for it, we'll now be able to explain. Because the fact that usually we say that Gerim are not considered related to each other, and therefore they could testify for each other, even if they were related biologically, is because this disqualification of relatives is a din, it's a gzeiras hakosov. It's not because they naturally feel connected to each other and therefore there may be certain biases, etc. It's a gzeiras hakosov. Now, since halachically they are not considered related, therefore they're not going to be disqualified. But back to our case, if we're speaking about a situation of an edus, which is not the full power of edus, it's just coming to clarify something larger, in other words, something that even Seichel would dictate, that they're just coming to clarify this matter, because again, we have the calculations anyways based on the calendar, so it's not the real din of edus, according to Reb Shimon. So then, the problems with relatives in this types of edus is not the gzeiras hakosov problem. In this case, we would say the problem is just because they're feeling biased towards each other, and therefore they might want to cover up for each other, etc. And therefore, since this idea of relatives feeling close to each other is something it's going to exist even by brothers that converted, as we can see practically. Therefore, going back to the case of Moshe and Aaron, if we say that Moshe and Aaron could testify for each other, and they are kosher for edus, so we can learn from that. Also, for the relatives after Matan Torah would also be kosher to testify for each other. So this is all Rab Shimon. However, the halacha is actually according to the Rabbanon that krovim relatives are pasul, are disqualified for edus hachodesh. Which, based on everything we were saying till now, that would tell us that by kiddush hachodesh there is a proper din of edus. It's not only that it's the regular kind of, it's not only that it's the edus that's as an additional thing to the calculations. We're having some edus as well, but we need full proper edus as well, according to the Rabbanon that say that we can't have relatives. And what's the reason for the Rabbanan saying this? Says the Rebbe, from the actual fact that Torah tells us that we do have to have Eidos that saw the new moon, because Kadesh, as Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, when they'll see the moon in this particular state, this is the way you'll sanctify the new moon. So from the actual fact that Torah tells it to us, despite the fact that Beis Din is anyways going to calculate when the new moon is going to be, so seemingly what's the point of the Eidos? Furthermore, we're actually going to rely on this calculation, even in the time when they were Makadesh al Pi Ariyah, when they were sanctifying the new month based on the sightings. Because if Beis Din knows in their calculations that the moon cannot be seen, and Eidos come along and say they saw the moon, we're actually not going to rely on them. So why do we even need to have the witnesses coming? But clearly the Torah says, yes, you have calculations, and the Torah wants you to have Eidos. This itself tells the Rabbanan, the second opinion, that the Torah wants something in addition to the calculations. And therefore the Rabbanan learn that the Torah wants to add that the establishing of Rosh Chodesh should be not only based on calculations, which are birur, just to clarify and to verify, yes, the new moon came, but rather it should also have the strength of the din of Eidos, which we know the Torah gives again a special power to the Eidos, al pi shnei eidim yakum davar. So this was the opinion of Reb Shimon and the opinion of the Rabbanan. But now the Rebbe says, according to this, now we need to understand the other way around. If in fact we are establishing the Rosh Chodesh based on these two Eidim Ksherim, al pi shnei eidim yakum davar, so why is the whole idea of Rosh Chodesh different and unique in this case, that we're not only relying on the Eidos and the investigation and the questioning that we have for the Eidos and all of that, but we also want the calculations? To the extent that if the Eidos are not going to align with the calculations, we're not going to rely on them. So why do we need to have both of these things? So the Rebbe is going to explain this al pi chassidus, pnimi yisonyanim. The Rebbe says both in each one of these two ways, Eidei Re'iyah, the Eidos that cited the new moon, and Cheshbei, the calculations that Beis Din make, each one has a specific advantage or quality that the other one doesn't have. And the Torah wanted that the establishing of Rosh Chodesh, being that this is something so general, so fundamental in Torah and mitzvahs, it should have both qualities, as we will soon explain, and that's why we need to have both together, both the citing as well as the calculation. In order to understand this, the Rebbe first introduces the famous Maimer Azal on HaChodesh Hazelochem, which Rashi also tells us in the beginning of Chumash, that really the Torah should have started with HaChodesh Hazelochem. Rashi explains, why should it have started HaChodesh Hazelochem? So Rashi says, this is the first mitzvah that the Yidden were commanded. We know that the Yidden were commanded about HaChodesh Hazelochem while they were still in Mitzrayim, before leaving. And the question is, why in fact is this mitzvah the first mitzvah that the Yidden were given? Seemingly the first mitzvah should have been Anochi Hashem Elokecha, accepting the yoke of Hashem, which is the beginning and the foundations of all the mitzvahs. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, Anochi Hashem Elokecha is in fact the beginning and foundation of all mitzvahs, as far as the fulfilling of the mitzvahs practically. In order for a person to fulfill the mitzvahs properly, obviously he first has to accept Oil Malchus Shamayim. But HaChodesh Hazelochem is the purpose, it's the goal of all of Torah and mitzvahs, as we'll see in a moment. And that's why it's explained and said as an introduction to all the mitzvahs as the first mitzvah. What does it mean that HaChodesh Hazelochem is the purpose of it all? The Rebbe is going to explain HaChodesh in the term of Chidush, in the idea of having something new. The whole purpose of Torah and mitzvah, says the Rebbe, is that Yidden should accomplish a Chidush, a novelty, something new in the creation. The Rebbe says it's known, the inner explanation of the Maimer Chazal that says, G'doilim Maaseh Tzadikim, greater is the acts of the Tzadikim, what the Tzadikim accomplished, more than Maaseh Shamayim V'Aretz, it's more than the creation itself. Because Maaseh Shamayim V'Aretz is the creation, Hashem is creating Yesh Me'ayin, something out of nothing. But Tzadikim accomplish a Chidush. They make that the Yesh, the existence, should be bottled, should be nullified to the ayin, should be completely bottled to Hashem. And why is that called G'doilim? Why is that greater? The Rebbe says, the Rebbe bases this on a Maimer Chazal. So the Rebbe doesn't go into the whole story over here, but very, very briefly the story was the Rabbi Chanina ben Doiso was very, very poor, and his wife, she wanted to have something more, and a golden leg had come down from Shamayim into their house, and later they were shown that this is a leg that's missing from their table in Gan Eden, and she wanted it should be taken back. Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa davened for that, and the golden leg was taken back. The Gemara says that the Rebbe now quotes this part, that the second miracle is greater than the first. Because generally from Shamayim things are usually given. Things are created, not taken back. In other words, this ness of returning something, making it into ayin, making it into nothing, making the yesh into nothing, is greater than the ness of creating something from nothing. So going back to the point again, this is the same idea. The Eibishter creates ayin into yesh. The chidush that Yidden do through their avodah is making everything bottle to make it to make it shouldn't be in existence, should be bottled to Hashem. That's the chidush. Says the Rebbe, this is the hint in the words hachodesh hazeh lochem. Chodesh is in the word chidush. The power of chidush hachodesh hazeh lochem was given to Yidden. Because through Torah and mitzvahs, we make the world a dira lo yizbarich. We make the world a place for Hashem. Says the Rebbe, with this we'll also understand the medrash on the following pasuk. It says, Toivim hashnayim in ha'echad. 2 is better than 1. Says the medrash in connection to Parshas HaChodesh. What does it mean, Toivim hashnayim in ha'echad? Greater or better is a parsha that was said, Al Pishnayim was said through 2, meaning Moshe and Aaron, than a parsha that was just said B'yachid, a parsha that was just given through Moshe. So Shnayim, which parsha was said by 2? Through 2. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe v'el Aaron be'eretz Mitzrayim leimor hachodesh hazeh lochem. So the Rebbe asks, seemingly there are a number of parshas from the Torah where Hashem is speaking el Moshe v'el Aaron. Why is the Medrash focusing specifically on this parsha, hachodesh hazeh lochem? So the explanation is, this idea that we just explained, hachodesh, is from the word chidush, which we said explains the whole purpose of what Torah and mitzvahs is all about. To bring about this chidush, to make this world bottled to Hashem. Now, since the chidush of Torah and mitzvahs is in 2 general nukudas, 2 general ideas, which we're going to discuss in a minute, one of them more being connected to Moshe, one of them being more connected to Aaron. Therefore, this parsha, which speaks about this chidush, emphasizes the connection to both of them. And that's why the Medrash specifically says about Toivim Hashanayim and Ha'echad on this parsha, HaChodesh hazeh lochem. What are these 2 general ideas? Says the Rebbe, we spoke many times explaining the expression Dira loy yizbarich betachtoinim, to make a dwelling place for Hashem down here, that it includes 2 general points. The first one is that the tachtoinim, we need to work on the tachtoinim to make them fitting, that they should be a place for Hashem. That's one general idea, that's one major chidush, as we're going to explain. And number 2, mitzad l'mayla, from Hashem's perspective, in other words, the idea that we're making a dira for the very essence of Hashem. That Hashem himself in his very essence should be able to stand here, revealed down here, like a person, lahavdil. That in his own home, he's there completely with his whole essence. And in both of these areas, there's a tremendous chidush. Number 1, in order for the tachtoinim to be able to be a dira lo yizbarich, as we said before, they have to be mevatel themselves, they have to completely nullify themselves to become nothing, to become completely bottle to Hashem. And similarly, the idea that Atzmus should be able to come down over here is also a tremendous chidush. Usually the whole creation, Me'ayin Liyesh, is only of what we call a ha'ara, like a little reflection, a little ray of Hashem. But Dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, it's only with the words of Hashem that the whole world was created. But it's specifically through the avodah of a yid in nullifying the yesh la'ayin. This is the tremendous chidush happens, that he draws down the very essence of Hashem down here. Says the Rebbe, this is the reason that the Medrash says this on this idea of Toivim Hashnayim and Ha'echad, specifically in connection to this pasuk of HaChodesh hazeh lochem, because it's in this section which is expressing the whole purpose of Torah and mitzvahs. And not only that, but in both ideas. Because as we just said, there are these 2 ideas. There's the idea of the world becoming a keli for Hashem, and the idea of Hashem coming down into the world. And this is represented by Moshe and Aaron. Because Moshe is said to be Shushvino de Malka. The term Shushvina is usually referred to the Unterführers, those that bring the Chosan and the Kala to the Chuppah. Moshe is said to be the Shushvin, the good friend, the one leading Kvayachal Hashem, bringing Hashem down here. And Aaron is called the Shushvina de Matronisa, the Unterführer, the one who's bringing the queen to the Eibishter, bringing the Yidden closer to the Eibishter. So Moshe is drawing down a Lekusmal Maila Lamata. He's giving the Koyach for this idea of the Chidush, that Atzmus should be able to come down here. On the other hand, Aaron is called Shushvina de Matronisa, is about elevating the world. He's the one giving us the koyach to elevate all the lowly things and bring them upwards, making the world a dira lo yizbarich. And that's what we have, both Moshe and Aaron, in this idea of HaChodesh HaZelochem. Says the Rebbe, just like we have HaChodesh HaZelochem, that it expresses the whole purpose of Torah and mitzvahs, as far as how they impact the world, so too it also brings out the effect of Torah and mitzvahs on Yidden. Yidden generally, as we know, are compared to the moon, the Mo'er HaKotan, the small luminary. As the Pasuk says regarding the Yidden, referring to Yaakov, but the Yidden are also called that way, Miyokum Yaakov ki Kotanu. Who's going to help Yaakov stand up? Yaakov is called Kotan. So the Yidden are called Kotan. And the Chidush of the Levana, when the moon is renewed and it becomes bigger, that represents the renewal of Yidden, and the Yidden being elevated through Torah and mitzvahs, going from small to big. But within the Aliyah of Yidden, again, we have two categories, we have two ideas. Number one, we have what's called the Avodah, working with our Koiches Pnimim, with our inner faculties of the person, which generally, this is the Avodah where a person works with, according to Tam Vadas, according to logic and reason, etc. And the advantage of that Avodah is, because that's more B'Pnimi, that's more internalized. In other words, it permeates the whole person himself, his intellect, his emotions, or every aspect of the person who's serving Hashem. That's sort of the regular, normal mode of the person. But then we have the Avodah called, we're working with Koyches Makifim, with those tremendous, great powers that are all-encompassing of the Neshama, with the very essence of the Neshama. This is mainly expressed when a Yid is completely bottled, completely nullified to Hashem's desire in a way that goes beyond logic and reason. So these are the two general avodas. Says the Rebbe, this is now the inner reason for why Rosh Chodesh, which again Rosh Chodesh is all to do with this idea of the renewal of the Yidden. Why it has both of these ideas together. You need to have both. The Eidei Re'iyah, the Eidas that saw the moon. You also have the calculations that Beis made, because we need to combine these two qualities together. There is the idea of Re'iyah through the Eidos. Re'iyah, generally, seeing something means it's beyond logic and reason. Whatever you see, it doesn't matter whether you understood it or not. This is the way it is. And it has the Eidei Re'iyah of the Re'iyah through Eidos, which, as we said before, this gives the power of Torah into something called Gzeiros HaKosov, which represents this avodah of Bittul, which is L'mayla Mitam Vadas, higher than logic. But at the same time, you also need to have, and it also needs to fit in with the calculations, which means with Tam Vadas, because we need that Bittul that's higher than Tam Vadas should also come down and permeate the person in a Pnimiyizdik way.